think there are at least two ways that you can use scenarios. One is in a way that a man in the United States, James Lukashevsky, often teaches in classes for the Public Relations Society of America and the IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators, and that's in crisis planning. And I think it's very interesting. Well, if we look at what a scenario is, it's some way in which we look at the past and try to envision what might happen in the future. So you're saying if you plan for a crisis, it might depend on what kind of company you're working for, but there are certain accidents that are likely to happen in different industries. So a chemical industry is, you can anticipate having problems with transportation of chemicals, or oftentimes in plants. Airlines can anticipate a plane crash, and so on. So the thing to do is not just to come up with a crisis plan that says, do we have enough pencils or computers for the journalists, and who's going to be the spokesperson, but if such a crisis happens, what's the likely scenario, and how would it unfold, and who would do what, and how would we deal with this particular scenario. And I think then one can begin to anticipate ahead of time who would do what, and how the crisis would be handled. The other one is a technique that one of our doctoral students from Korea has worked on, did a thesis, a doctoral dissertation on. And this is the use of scenarios in strategic management, or when public relations participates in strategic management. If public relations participates in strategic management, the basic idea is that the senior communication officer should be part of the decision-making process when major decisions are made, so that they're able to anticipate the consequences that the decision might have on different stakeholders, because basically consequences create stakeholders. If someone is not affected by a decision, they're not a stakeholder. So what might be the consequences on a community, or on employees, or on consumers, and so on. So the scenario, when that happens, management often doesn't pay attention to the public relations person, without some kind of thinking or concrete examples of what might happen if they make a certain decision. So the scenarios are constructed by looking at the consequences of a decision, and then talking to people who might be affected by that decision, and say, how would you behave, what might you do, and this might be something like filing a lawsuit, going to the journalist, or something that would have certain consequences on the organization. So a scenario is a way to help management envision what might happen if it makes certain kinds of decisions. I think it's impossible to manage the reputation of a business, because that often suggests to people that if you just put out positive messages, that will create a good reputation. I think reputation, for the most part, if you ask, a reputation is what a member of a stakeholder or a public or stakeholder group thinks when he or she thinks of the organization. And what they usually think of is the behavior of the organization, what it has done recently, and how has that affected them. So the only way to manage a reputation essentially is by participating in the decisions that produce the behavior that people remember. So, and I think that's largely done through relationships, that reputation is generally a byproduct or the result of good relationships with your stakeholders. So then the question is, how can you use I use the term digital media because I think there are things other than the social media that are important, blogs and company blogs and so on. The important thing to recognize is that it's impossible to control communication going to stakeholders now. I don't believe it was ever possible in the past, but public relations people had the illusion that they could do that. So something I called the illusion of control. Members of publics always had the ability to decide which messages they wanted to pay attention to and which ones they didn't. And it was always very typical to think that if a news story appeared in a newspaper with a circulation of 12 million people, that 12 million people saw that message. In reality, 1 or 2% probably saw that message. So it's the same thing now with the digital media, but it's much easier for publics to control the messages that they expose themselves to now than it was in the future. It makes information seeking much easier. So publics really have control of the whole communication process. Even on something like Facebook, you may have a fan page on Facebook, but that doesn't mean that there are very many people paying much attention to it. If it's not relevant to them, if it doesn't provide them useful information, relevant information, they won't pay attention to it. So it's necessary to have certain kind of symmetrical or dialogical properties when you use the new media. That is, that it's an interaction with publics, and you provide them information that it's important to them and information that's relevant to them, and it answers their questions. It's often called authentic communication. That is, it's not just what you want them to hear, but what they need to know and what they want to hear. So I think this is the kind of communication I've been advocating for 40 years, what I call symmetrical communication. And essentially, I believe it's impossible to do anything else now with the new media. My colleagues and I conducted a study we called the Excellence Study that was finished in 2002. And we identified approximately 8 characteristics of excellent communication. And I won't mention all of them, but the most important one was the participation of public relations in the strategic management or strategic decision processes of the organization. You might also call this the empowerment of public relations. Now, this is important because if I see public relations as a way of being socially responsible so that the organization becomes more sustainable. And you do this by building relationships by the people who are affected by the organization, its behavior, its products, its the way it treats its employees, and so on. And these may be government, employees, communities, consumers, and on. People who live in areas that might be affected by the pollution from a chemical plant or by transportation problems and so on. So the role of public relations is to identify who those stakeholders are and then develop communication programs to build relationships with them. So hence the term public relations essentially means relationships with publics. If you're not part of that strategic decision-making process, there is very little way that a public relations person would know what management is doing, what effects it's going to have on publics, and what kind of publics there would be. So therefore, it's typical behavior is to think there is such a thing as a general public. That is, everybody is paying attention, and that's never the case. And so then just disseminating messages through the mass media with no particular public in mind. So then public relations essentially becomes, in English we would call an information dump. You're just dumping information out there in the hopes that somebody will use it. For it to be strategic, you have to know who's being affected by the organization, which publics are important, then how do you build relationships with them.